George Mason University professor Joseph Jenitin Palawa teaches a class on post-Civil War westward expansion and how it impacted Native Americans and federal Indian policy. He argues that during the Reconstruction era, Native Americans frequently worked directly with the U.S. government. But in the end, the advance of settlers to the west was an overwhelming force that still cost Native Americans their lands. His class is about an hour and 15 minutes.
Today, we're going to pick up with U.S. federal tribal relationships as we've been talking about over the last couple of classes. Although you will notice, and I did warn you, we're jumping forward just slightly. Last class we were talking a bit about removal and the establishment of reservations in the 1830s and 1840s, early 1850s. We're actually going to jump forward just a little bit into directly into the Civil War and after. One of the things that I want to try and do here is think about the ways that Native history and the development of the West were directly connected to the Civil War and Reconstruction, even though we don't always think of those things as related to one another. In our minds, I think that we kind of separate westward expansion and the Civil War from one another, but for the people who lived through that, I don't think they would have separated in their minds. They would have seen a lot of connections between those things. So I want to try and get into that mindset today. When we think about the term Reconstruction, we usually conventionally use it to describe a series of policies and developments in the South between like 1863 and 1877. These were policies that were designed to integrate freed slaves into a mainstream population and readmit seceded states back into the Union. Welcome, everyone.
I didn't realize George Mason had 3 student unions, did you?
Freed peoples themselves took a really active role in Reconstruction. So former slaves took a really active role in the Reconstruction process. But there were big questions, right? This is just at the aftermath, at the end of the Civil War. And there were big questions that the nation as a whole faced. You know, would Reconstruction result in a kind of a revolution? Would this be a second revolution that was resulting in an entirely new nation? Or would it preserve the old republic somehow, right? These questions weren't decided at the moment that the Civil War ended. And for the people who lived through the war and sacrificed so much, these were hugely important questions. People didn't want to believe that they would have made the sacrifices they did over the previous years and then come out of it at the other end without some major change, right? Some positive good. Again, we oftentimes think about this in relationship to freed slaves and Reconstruction, but Native people played a role in this too, and the West played a role in this too. So that's kind of what I want us to think about here, kind of connecting the South and the West and federal Indian policy in this time period. But I want to do something, I want to do something in 1 second, but I want to suggest a different way of thinking about Reconstruction. And that is thinking about Reconstruction more broadly, not just focused on the South, but thinking about the West and how what we might call Indian country was reconstructed at the same time. The people who lived in the mid-19th century, as I said, wouldn't have separated events in the South from other events going on. If you look at newspapers from the time, for example, newspapers were covering Johnson's impeachment, and columns right next to it had to do with Native communities in the West, right? So these things were intimately tied together with one another. These events were all part of one moment, and we can learn a lot about the larger nation by thinking about Native American history in this time period, so that's what we're going to do. But I want to start with a short sort of exercise. I want to look at a couple of images, and some of you have seen these images before, but first, and I apologize for the resolution here, but so this is April 9th, 1865, Wilmer McLean's parlor, Appomattox Courthouse. This is a drawing by Alfred Wad. And again, kind of do your best with the contrast and resolution here, but what do you see? What's going on? And obviously knowing the date and the context, what's going on here? Eleanor, what do you see?
I think I see Robert E. Lee in the chair in the front.
Okay, yep, Robert E. Lee here in the sort of the lighter uniform. the lighter colored.
Guy Parker in the middle?
Nope. This is U.S. Grant next to Lee. Sorry again, the resolution. What's going on in this picture? What's happening? Yeah, in the back, Dan.
Lee's surrendering to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse.
Yeah, okay, so this is the surrender of the Army of the Potomac. It's going to set forth the series of events that ultimately, a few months later, would end the war completely. Hugely important moment, hugely tense, historic moment, right? And Eleanor kind of tipped us off, because I know that she's seen this image before, that Ely Parker, who you guys are a little bit familiar with, is in this picture too. Can anybody pick out Ely Parker? Again, it's hard because of the contrast, but he's standing on the right side. He's like the third person in. There's one person that looks sort of a little bit darker, maybe a little tawnier than the others. Right in front of him there is the actual drafting of the surrender agreement down on the table. So if you look up from the table, the guy standing over the right shoulder of the man writing is Ely Parker. Who was Ely Parker? We talked a bit about him. You read a bit about him. Who was he?
He's the chief that led the Tonawanda Indians in their fight with New York State about land and their reservations.
Yeah, okay. So the last time we heard about Ely Parker, he was leading a resistance campaign against removal for the Tonawanda Seneca, leading a fight against the Ogden Land Company in New York State, which he was able to, with the help of several others, conclude successfully, in a sense, in 1857 by helping the Tonawanda secure title to part of their homeland in western New York. Fast forward a few years later, he's become friends with U.S. Grant. Grant requests him and his assistance at Vicksburg, and he serves through the rest of the war as part of Grant's inner circle, ultimately becoming his personal military secretary and then later aide-de-camp. He was at Appomattox Courthouse and in Wilmer McLean's parlor. This image isn't quite accurate, though, because it was Parker who drafted the surrender agreement. It was Parker who actually wrote out the surrender agreement that would be the beginning of the end of the Civil War. And there's a story about this moment. I'm not sure if it's a sort of an apocryphal story. It certainly gets retold quite frequently. But that is, Grant and his men were at McLean's parlor. There's a really interesting story about McLean too, right? That the war started in his backyard and ended in his front parlor. He moved between Manassas and Appomattox Courthouse during the war. Ken Burns talks about it in his Civil War series. But Grant's there with his men, and they're sort of mud-splattered and fatigued. Lee comes in, and Grant introduces him to his men. They shake hands, and then he gets to Ely Parker. And the story goes, and Robert Todd Lincoln was one of the people who told this story, was that when Lee came to Parker, he kind of, he didn't really take a step back, but he kind of reacted. And there was, some people believe, people who were in the room, that maybe he thought that Parker was African American or potentially mixed raced. And there's a tense moment. This was a really tense moment. Lee composed himself, put his hand out to shake Parker's hand, and said, "I'm glad to see there's at least one real American here today." And the story goes, Parker grasps his hand and says, "Sir, today we are all Americans." Again, it's a pretty nice story. I don't know if it actually happened, but it sounds really good, right? Okay, so this is a story of inclusion, though, right? I mean, this is a Native person being included in an incredibly tense and a hugely important historic moment, and he's right at the center of the action, right? Playing a key role. The reason that he ended up actually drafting it is because one of Grant's other men, I believe it was John Rawlins, was trying to write out the terms as Lee and Grant talked them through, but he was so nervous that he kept spilling ink, and he couldn't sort of get it under control, so Parker was sort of the more calm one. Parker was also the most literate of any of Grant's inner circle as well. So this is 1865. It tells us a story of inclusion, right? I mean, like I said, this is. Would you agree with me on that? That here's a native man right at the center, right at the heart of this like key historic moment. I want to jump a couple of years and look at another famous image from that time. This is a painting by John Gast, American Progress, 1872.
Manifest Destiny.
Mm-hmm. So it's an image of manifest destiny. What do you see? What can you see in this picture? And again, I apologize for the resolution, but what can you see? Thomas.
The woman kind of represents like God's like rite of passage and like maybe something kind of saying like, yeah, this is your duty to do it.
Okay, so there's this giant angelic woman sort of floating across the landscape, right? She represents Columbia, which is kind of the physical manifestation of America prior to Uncle Sam. But all right, so she's floating over the landscape. What's she bringing with her? What's she doing there? What's she carrying?
Telegraph wire.
Okay, she's carrying a telegraph wire. She's carrying a telegraph wire from the east to the west, literally connecting the east to the west. What else do you see? Good, Macy.
The train.
Okay.
Also connecting the east to the west.
Okay, yeah, there's like 3 different trains there. So there's sort of industrialization taking place, transportation development taking place. Again, these are all facing westward. They're all moving westward. Jonathan.
Towards the left of the picture, you see the Indians basically sort of like in fear looking up at like all this coming at them.
Yeah. Okay, so down here you see like about 4 native people kind of looking back over their shoulder, exiting stage left. What are some other elements of this picture? Taylor.
The Indians are kind of like in the dark, and Columbia is like bringing the light of civilization westward.
Yeah, I mean the whole sort of right side or east side of this painting of this image is bright, right? It's just literally bringing light, bringing the light of civilization to the west. Okay, what else? Janie, did you have your hand up? That was what you were going to say? Anything else? So there's like some covered wagons, some stagecoaches. So there's settlers moving west. Can you see these guys down here? They're kind of carrying like pickaxes. It looks like they might be miners. You really can't see it in this picture, but in the back right-hand corner, there's like there's some bridges and ships. There's like shipping going on. Again, sort of illustrating like industry.
Is that the Mississippi?
I'm not sure if it's any particular river, but it looks like it has kind of a big horseshoe-shaped bend in it, so probably not. But Dawn.
Yeah, just look back to everything's already been cleared out, and
Okay, so it looks like everything is. It looks like the landscape is clear. You can kind of see like maybe some buffalo, but somebody mentioned the Indians down here, and it looks like you said that it looks like they're fearful. If we're able to see the picture better, it kind of doesn't look like they're fearful. In fact, they look very sort of placid. They look very calm, and the only real sort of movement there there's not a lot of movement there. It kind of looks. It looks calm. It's benign, right? There's not any violence going on in this image, is there? Native people are sort of moving out of the way for civilization's march west. There's one. I've looked at this painting over and over again. There's like one creature that actually seems kind of angry that this is all happening. There's a bear that's like looking over his shoulder and growling. You can't see the bear, but that's like the only creature that's actually kind of angry that this whole thing is happening. Okay, so these are 2 images separated by about 7 years, right? Both kind of around the end of the Civil War. And I wondered how we can understand these 2 images together. Right? One is about including Native people. Ely Parker's right at the center of the action. He's actually doing the thing that's going to be hugely significant, which is drafting the agreement that begins to end the Civil War. A couple of years later, very famous image is Native people sort of benignly exiting out of the way for civilization. So what I want to suggest as we talk today is that there's kind of two different ideas that are emerging about Native communities and their position in the post-Civil War United States. On the one hand, there were people, reformers, people who had worked in anti-slavery and abolition, who believed that Native people could and should be part of a broader American nation, who could and should be part of a reconstructed America. Of course, they had a caveat, right, that they had to do so in ways that mainstream Americans could understand and appreciate. But these reformers were optimistic that given the right opportunities, Native people would want to do this on their own. On the other hand, one second, Michael. On the other hand, some believed that Native people had to be shoved out of the way, violently if necessary, that their only hope for salvation was if they were forced to assimilate as fast as possible. In very similar ways to the African American experience during Reconstruction and the immediate aftermath of the war, this time period represented a moment of optimism, right, for Native communities. But like the legacy of Reconstruction itself, that was a pretty fleeting moment. And we can almost see this transition over the course of only about 7 or 8 years. What were you going to say, Mike?
I'm surprised that anybody was optimistic, especially if you've read the Cherokee removal book. I mean, if you look at the start of the book in the early 1800s, early 1820s, the Cherokees were basically becoming farmers like George Washington wanted them to.
Sure.
And they're becoming successful farmers.
Sure.
And they just basically get thrown off their land because somebody else wants it. So why would anybody at this point in time be optimistic that everything was going to work out for some people?
Yeah, I think that we have to put ourselves in that context of the immediate post-war moment, right? Again, think about the sacrifices, think about the lives lost, think about the amount of investment that people had, particularly northern reformers and those sorts of people. They had to believe that a new world was possible. They certainly did so. They certainly believed that with the right opportunities and the right sort of programs like the Freedmen's Bureau, that it would be able to happen for former slaves. And so I think it is fair to say that there was one school of thought that was optimistic about this at the end of the Civil War for Native people. In order to understand how and why, though, Native American issues played an important role in the middle and late 19th century, I think we have to go back a little ways. Maybe not quite as far as the Indian Removal Act and the Cherokee, as Michael was suggesting, but I think it's important to look at some of the events in Indian country that were overshadowed by events of the Civil War itself. And so we want to think about what we might call like the hidden, in quotes, hidden Indian history of the Civil War. Native issues received little attention during the presidency of Abraham Lincoln. It was clear that Lincoln was interested in tribal communities and in reforming the Office of Indian Affairs. He looked at the Office of Indian Affairs as being corrupt and mismanaged, and he did believe that it needed to be restructured, that it needed new personnel, and he clearly wanted to do that, but the events of the Civil War monopolized his time. Most people believed at the time that the Office of Indian Affairs was a corrupt office. It was a place where political appointees made themselves filthy rich at the expense of Native people, in particular through fraudulent land treaties and mismanagement of rations and annuities for reservations. All those things characterized this era. And we did have a little experience reading about and thinking about sort of the ways in which treaties could be fraudulent in thinking about the Treaty of Buffalo Creek and the Compromise Treaty a few years later. We compared that to the Treaty of New Echota, which we're going to be talking a little bit more about again, and those sorts of things. When we think about events involving Native people during the war, we usually focus on things that happened far from the front lines. But that's not entirely accurate. Native people engaged in the larger struggle in a variety of ways. For example, some Cherokee in Indian Territory, many of whom had owned slaves, had been plantation owners, signed treaties with the Confederate States of America because they believed that they'd receive fairer treatment than they had with the United States. They fought in both the eastern and western theaters of the war. In the east, an adopted Cherokee man named William Thomas led the Thomas Legion, as it was called, in engagements in against Union forces in Tennessee in 1862, in North Carolina, and ultimately in Virginia in 1864 and 65. In fact, Thomas's Legion fought with the Army of the Potomac and fought with General Lee. Some of these men were at Appomattox Courthouse, although not in Wilmer McLean's parlor, but were at Appomattox Courthouse in 1865 in April. Out to the west, Stand Watie, who's another Cherokee man, became a Confederate general. He led the 1st Indian Brigade of the Army of the Trans-Mississippi. He had the distinction of officially being the last Confederate general to surrender when he did so after the Battle of Fort Towson in June 1865. The most well-known Native unit in the Union Army was Company K of the 1st Michigan Sharpshooters. This was made up of Ottawa, Delaware, Huron, Oneida, Potawatomi, and Ojibwe people. They fought with Grant when Grant assumed command of the Army of the Potomac. And I realized earlier I referred to Lee's Army as the Army of the Potomac, but I meant Army of Northern Virginia. I apologize. They fought at the Battle of the Wilderness. They fought at Spotsylvania. They fought in Petersburg and were well decorated. Although there were little interest paid to the events of Indian country during the Civil War, there are a couple of sort of flashpoint moments that did garner a lot of public attention. And one of those happened in 1862. It's been called various different things, but I prefer to call it the United States-Dakota War. This is the United States-Dakota War in Minnesota in 1862. And this kind of like thrust Indian affairs into the public eye. So in August and September of 1862, there were starving Dakota community members who moved out and attacked local white settlers around the Lower Sioux Agency, which was near St. Paul in Minnesota. Now, the attack resulted from the failure of the federal government to provide rations that they'd agreed to in a series of treaties starting in 1851. So the federal government had agreed to provide treaty rations, annuities, to help the Dakota community as they ceded land to the United States, to the Minnesota Territory. Now, this is directly connected to the wartime economy. As the Union diverted funding to the war effort, things like treaty annuities for tribal communities were cut or were unable to be followed up with. The failure intensified a situation that was already kind of volatile in the aftermath of dispossession in Minnesota and non-native settlement. So there were already sort of tensions between settlers and native people there, and then this sort of just exacerbated all of that. The Dakota warriors seeking to procure food and supplies for their families, attacked local farms and homesteads. They killed settlers. They captured immigrants, as well as mixed race men and women and children, people who had intermarried into their community. Estimates of these events place the death toll at approximately 500 non-native people, along with an unknown number of native people. Roughly 270 white and mixed-race men, women, and children were held captive by the Dakota warriors as well. The United States military gained control of the situation by the end of September 1862, and they established a military tribunal. They tried and convicted 303 of the 393 Dakota, quote-unquote, hostiles or Dakota soldiers. Then, the tribunal convicted and condemned all 303 men to execution, but Abraham Lincoln, as commander-in-chief, pardoned 264 of them. On December 26, 1862, only a few days prior to issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, which would be January 1st, 1863, the United States military hanged 38 Dakotas in the largest mass execution in its history. So I want you to think about that for a minute. And I'm still not sure, even though I've thought about this and talked about this in different contexts over the years, One calendar week separates Abraham Lincoln issuing the Emancipation Proclamation and presiding over the largest mass execution of people of color in the Army's history as Commander-in-Chief. So these things happened within the same calendar week. Politically for Lincoln, it was a difficult situation. He did pardon more than 200 of the Dakota soldiers. People in Minnesota thought that he had been too lenient, that they all should have been executed. The events of the U.S.-Dakota War received some public attention. Like I said, the commenters in Minnesota believed that, that the military and the militia had been right. Some of them criticized Lincoln for being too lenient. Other outspoken critics, though, looked at this and took this as an opportunity to argue for the need to reform Indian policy and reform the Office of Indian Affairs. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs at the time, a guy named William Dole, argued that the problems in Minnesota emerged from the inability to control non-native settlers, right? That it was because of the tensions between the non-native settlers with native people that ultimately led to this intensification. And that as westward expansion would continue, as he envisioned it, he envisioned westward expansion continuing after the war, that these kinds of tensions of non-native settlers engaging with native people and vice versa would get worse. Right? In a lot of ways, he was prophetic there. And we're going to get to that when we talk about the 1870s here in a few minutes. 2 years later, here's just some information from the time, as well as a sketch of the execution and the military prison camp at Fort Snelling. So this all happened in what's present-day Mankato, Minnesota. A couple of years later, there was another major event. In November 29th, 1864, a colonel named John Shivington led more than 700 volunteer U.S. soldiers into a village of peaceful Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians in southeastern Colorado.
This was not the U.S. Army. This was like the Colorado National Guard.
This was the Colorado militia.
Yeah.
Although when we talk about mid-19th century or 19th century military, we didn't really have a standing army. We had militias. Militias that volunteered in a time of war. We had essentially no standing peacetime army. And so for all intents and purposes, these were the men who made up the U.S. Army. Although in this instance, we would call them the Colorado Militia. The Cheyenne and Arapaho, and this is outside of Eads, Colorado, were led by a number of men, but one of them was Black Kettle. They assembled along Sand Creek to distinguish themselves from other Indians in the region who had been actively involved in military engagements with the U.S. So they set up essentially what was a camp that was a peace camp, right? And in fact, they flew two flags over their camp. One was the United States flag, the other was a white flag. This is what distinguished their community. Attacking at dawn, Shivington and his volunteers flushed the Indians from their village. And as I said, even though Black Kettle, who was a proponent of peace and had a United States and white surrender flag over his lodge, the soldiers relentlessly pursued the fleeing Cheyenne and Arapaho. They pinned them in a dry stream bed, an area of maybe 700 or several hundred yards wide, and it was very like sandy, mucky soil, so hard to move through. And it was there that non-combatant women, children, and elderly, the weak, struggled, but could not escape the soldiers' small arms and howitzer fire, and more than 150 people lost their lives. On the non-native side, 9 people were killed. The massacre brought about, again, the ineffectiveness of federal Indian policy, brought it into the public eye, and coupled with the earlier events from Minnesota, inspired reformers and journalists across the nation. According to one scholar of American Indian history, said this is a never-to-be-forgotten symbol of what was wrong with the United States treatment of Indians, which reformers would never let fade from view. So, Michael, to go back to your question about optimism, maybe these events didn't inspire optimism, but certainly inspired action, right, and inspired work, motivated reformers to think in this way.
Why didn't these guys attack some of the hostile Indians?
This was, I mean, so this was not entirely uncommon in American Indian history, and we can go all the way back to the 1600s in the Virginia colony of peaceful or allied Indians being attacked, either out of ignorance or out of anger or sort of a misplaced aggression, all those sorts of things.
I just don't think this was part of U.S. policy. I think this was one man's racism.
But it's so remarkably similar to a dozen and a half other actions that happened around this time within 10 years. So I don't know how to separate this one out as something different from those others. It seems remarkably similar. In fact, we could go up as far as Wounded Knee in 1890, and seems pretty similar. Oh yeah, go ahead, Ian.
So there isn't documentation from the volunteer forces as to their motivations?
Oh,
or
sure.
Is it simply that they
so they were commanded to do this. Some of them stood down. Some of them wouldn't do it. Some of them laid their weapons down. There were a couple of federal commissions that looked into these events, and they were roundly condemned for being a massacre. Reformers were outraged by this kind of treatment, especially those who had worked in abolition and anti-slavery. Right, from their perspective. From their perspective, obviously this is something that would need to be dealt with as they were working through the issues of emancipation and freedom. 1 second, Lauren. But again, the West was going to become really important after the Civil War. Policymakers would look to the West as an outlet for North-South tensions. Right? Just because the war ends in 1865 doesn't mean that all of a sudden Northerners and Southerners don't still kind of want to kill each other. Right? Settling the West, developing the West, manifest destiny, all of these ideas become a kind of rallying cry and a way to sort of unite sections of the country with a shared interest, right? A shared goal. What were you gonna ask or say, Lauren?
I was just going to comment that it seems to me we could learn about whether this was policy or one man's racism by, since this got so much press and was commonly known, was there prosecutions against the people who caused the actions or not?
Yeah.
It seems to me if there wasn't, then it speaks to it being, more policy than a person's out-of-hand actions.
Yeah. I mean, again, so there were.
There were.
Yeah, but I don't know. I don't know if I can make that distinction. I mean, I understand you guys driving at this distinction. I don't know if I could make that distinction. No, I wasn't
driving anywhere. I guess I was curious as to whether there were prosecutions.
Yeah.
And there were.
Yeah. So one of the reasons that we know that policymakers saw the West as an outlet, as a place for a shared goal for the country, is that during the war, Congress actually moved to set in motion a series of policies that would help that to happen. A key one of those in 1862, Congress passed the Homestead Act. Right, this would hopefully encourage settlers to move west. Under the Homestead Act, a petitioner could claim 160 acres of land for free, as long as they lived on the land and farmed it for 5 years. So as long as they made improvements to the land, you could get up to 160 acres for free from the federal government under the Homestead Act. And there are other policies that went along with this, the Pacific Railroad Act and others that were also passed in 1862 to encourage westward development. So again, think about this though. There's this tension going on here where reformers are looking at these events and saying, look, we have to do something about this. And the language that they used was, the next great evil after slavery is Indian affairs. Right? This will be our goal after emancipation. This will be a goal once Reconstruction is taking place. So reformers and philanthropists wanted Native people to be treated humanely and fairly, something they believed had not happened, but at the same time, policymakers, landless citizens, and even non-native Western settlers simply wanted Native people out of the way and to develop the land.
previously they had all these lotteries and land companies and stuff like that. Why did they go to the Homestead Act?
Yeah, I think again it was to streamline and clarify land development. If you looked at what happened with like the squatters and preemption rights and other things in the old Northwest only kind of a generation before, it was a real mess. And I think that this was in the view of what we would think of today as a very progressive and liberal Congress in 1862 as a way to sort of start to pass policies to develop, use the government in a way to develop the nation in a way that they saw fit. So, I mean, we do see a real change over to a more activist government during the Civil War, and this is part of that. So I want to come back and think about something here for a second. And when I've talked about this in other audiences, I sort of pose a question of, what does home mean to you? What sorts of images, sights, sounds, smells, what kinds of things are, conjured up? We're all about to head off here in, really soon actually for a fall break. We're probably all going to our version of home in one way or another. So we could talk about the kinds of images and thoughts and associations that we have. And then I would ask, but can home and homeland mean something more? Could we think of something as a spiritual home or a place of belonging? What if you understood your home as the center of the world? Because you guys have read Keith Basso's Wisdom Sits in Places, maybe you could say something about that. What does Keith Basso say about what home and what land and landscape mean for the Western Apache? So what I'm driving at here is kind of a difference in the ways, different epistemological sort of understandings of home and land. So what does Keith Basso tell us about landscape and community?
It's hard for Native Americans to have history without the places where that history occurred.
Okay, so among the Western Apache, places on the landscape become placeholders for story and cultural knowledge that can then be transferred from older generations to younger generations, either by visiting those places, pointing out those places, telling those stories, right? So there's symbolic significance, a sacred geography. What were you going to say, Daniel?
I was going to say that it acts in one way as their conscience, the stories being attached to certain places, often with a moral lesson attached to them.
Yeah.
So that whenever they pass certain places, they're reminded of those stories. So they're reminded of the lesson.
Yeah. So not only are certain places on the landscape become placeholders for stories, but stories that actually convey knowledge about how one should act within that community, how one should behave, how one should carry themselves, how one should respect the members of their family or their elders or their siblings or whomever. These stories help to convey that cultural knowledge, right? Yeah. Macy?
Yeah, I was going to say that, and also it watches you grow. So the land watches you become like the type of person you should be. Mm-hmm. It kind of dictates your character a little bit, and it grows. Not that it grows with you, but the land watches you grow to become the person that you should be in your community and outside of it.
Yeah, great. Yeah, good. Yeah, Ian.
Yeah, I think the one thing that stuck out about it to me was his mentor, his Apache mentor, said something along the lines of that the land not only watches but also acts upon the individuals and influences the way they see the world.
Yeah. So by hearing those stories, by knowing, by gaining that knowledge from storytellers and elders, younger people then are reminded of those parts of their culture and how they're supposed to carry themselves by seeing those places or by saying the place names, right? So this gets us out of and away from kind of just a materialistic understanding of land as a resource, right? This is more than land as a material resource. This is land as a cultural resource. This is land as a sacred resource. Does it make sense? So, to many Native peoples, homelands represented more than just a place to live. This map shows the Black Hills in present-day South Dakota. And this serves as a good example. The Lakota believed that this land is their spiritual home. It represents a place where they emerged out of the earth as a people. The hills contain sacred power, many Lakota refer to it, and the word in Lakota translates to the heart of everything that is. So the words describing the Black Hills roughly translate into the heart of everything that is. And many Lakota, traditional Lakota, believe that the health of the world, even the entire universe, relies on their ability to conduct certain ceremonies within this region at certain times throughout the year. I would give another example now of Keith Basso and the Western Apache, but you all have read this, so I'll just summarize it really quickly, right? The Western Apache in what is now Arizona, home and place, had other functions, right? They believe that wisdom sits in places. In other words, that homelands provide a way for cultural knowledge to be transferred from one generation to another. While an outsider might look at a particular rock outcropping or creek and just see it as a rock outcropping or a creek, to the Apache, these landmarks make up a cultural geography. Elders use these markers to tell stories about the past and pass on important elements of cultural understanding to younger people. So if you no longer live in this homeland, right, to Western Apache, they would no longer be able to pass on this knowledge in the same way. It would represent a loss of cultural knowledge. As settlers flooded west after the Civil War, the United States government sought to build a road from Fort Laramie in present-day Wyoming to the gold fields in what is now Montana. Red Cloud, Lakota chief, along with his warriors and their Cheyenne and Arapaho allies, fought the military to a standstill between 1866 and 1868, so right after the war ends. This is known as Red Cloud's War. The resulting treaty was not only a very controversial one, but also laid the groundwork for additional violence. In the treaty, which is the Treaty of Fort Laramie of 1868, the U.S. government established the Great Sioux Reservation in the western part of what's now South Dakota. The Lakota would get to keep the Black Hills forever under this treaty without white encroachment. They also maintained rights to hunting grounds, but in return allowed the government to build roads and railroads through the territory. So that's the agreement. Unfortunately for the Lakota, gold was discovered in the Black Hills. And through military excursions and treaty violations in the 1870s, the Lakota lost this land and were confined to an increasingly smaller and smaller land base. It was this development that would also lead to the Battle of Little Bighorn or the Greasy Grass, and ultimately the Ghost Dance movement and the Wounded Knee Massacre. All of these tensions, conflicts, and events combined at the end of the 1860s in a movement to change the direction of Indian white affairs. And when U.S. Grant was elected president in 1868, he vowed to do just that. He first looked to one of his close friends, and now a person that we know quite a bit more about, Ely Parker. He appointed Parker to be the first Native American Commissioner of Indian Affairs that took office in 1869. But remember those images from the beginning of this lecture, right? At the same time, there's still these two conflicting images, right, about the position of Indian people. Two conflicting images, one of including Native people in ways that they had not before been included, and the other is pushing them out of the way for Western expansion and development. So let's think about what happens then. So here's just some images and pictures of Ely Parker. There he is as a youth at the top. In the middle, there he is as Grant's military secretary. On the top right, he is at Grant's headquarters at City Point, Virginia in 1864. It's actually in 1864 that Lincoln meets with Parker. They have a sit-down meeting in City Point, Virginia for quite a while. Parker was also pretty well known in anthropology because he worked with Lewis Henry Morgan on Lewis Henry Morgan's League of the Haudenosaunee in 1851. He was his sort of lead informant. And there's actually some question to how much of that book Parker actually wrote himself. There's some belief that Parker wrote quite a bit on his own. So Parker was one of the primary architects of the policy that the federal government would look to for Indian affairs after the war. And this is kind of analogous in some ways to Reconstruction, which is why I wanted to start with us thinking about the West and the South together at one time. I want to give you a little bit more background on Ely Parker here, but go ahead, Eleanor.
Was there more than one commissioner? Was he part of a group, or there's
No.
just...
There was one commissioner, the head of the Office of Indian Affairs, and he was that person from 1869 to 1871. And we'll talk about why he had such a short tenure in just a minute.
Did this become the BIA?
Yes, it was the BIA. It was just referred to as the Office of Indian Affairs until the 20th century, when it became known as the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So this is the same agency. So Parker was born in New York State in 1828. He belonged to the Wolf Clan, which was the same clan as Red Jacket. As a youth, he had studied at several non-native academies in New York. He studied at a Baptist mission school. He went to the Yates and Cayuga academies. When he was a teenager, he began to serve as an interpreter and spokesperson for the Tonawanda Seneca community in their land dispute against the Ogden Land Company, and that's the story that you all read a bit about. He helped Lewis Henry Morgan in the creation of his book, which is kind of looked at as the beginnings of Americanist anthropology, the League of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois. That same year, the Seneca raised him to the position of sachem and bestowing upon him the customary name Donahogawa, or open door. He pursued a career in law. He studied for the bar. He was denied access, though, because he was not a citizen. As we talked about previously, it wouldn't be until 1924 that citizenship would be universally bestowed upon Native people, although there were ways previously that some Native people could become citizens of the United States. Parker found success and adulation as a civil engineer. He actually worked for the Treasury Department. First in New York, he worked on canals. Then he spent some time in Detroit, and then ultimately in Galena, Illinois, where he built customs houses and met a store clerk and Mexican War veteran named Ulysses S. Grant. He also fought in the Civil War, as I said, alongside Grant from Vicksburg through Appomattox, and when the war ended, the general, after being elected president, appointed Parker Commissioner of Indian Affairs. So when Parker began his career in the federal government, he did so with decades of experience of working with Indian communities. He'd worked for his own tribal community as a spokesperson and negotiator. He'd spent time in Albany working with state legislators, advocating for the Tonawanda Seneca. He'd spent time in Washington, quite a bit of time actually, working with legislators there, advocating on behalf of his community. And the experiences that he had played a major role in the developments and the ideas that he had for Indian policy reform. His ideas focused on several things that become the heart of the peace policy. He wanted public oversight of policy administration. He wanted both native and non-native people to be able to oversee the development of Indian policy. He thought that this would help with sort of rooting out some of the mismanagement and fraud and things like that. He wanted to establish and protect specific land rights for tribal communities. He saw the sort of the piecemeal chopping away at tribal land bases as leading to much of the strife and tension in the West. So he wanted to protect and maintain specific land titles. If you remember, this was part of his goal with the Tonawanda Seneca, as they fought against the Ogden Land Company, was ultimately shoring up and making sure that they had rock solid legal title based on your United States legal precedents. He wanted to bureaucratize the Office of Indian Affairs. Again, he believed that the mismanagement of the office was oftentimes because it wasn't particularly professionalized. These were political appointees who maybe had no experience working with tribal communities at all, who had no knowledge of tribal law or anything like that, or federal Indian law. What's interesting is his plan to do that. At this point, the Office of Indian Affairs had been moved. It was originally in the War Department. It had been moved to the Interior Department. Parker wanted to move it back to the War Department. So what some scholars have said is that that's an indication of wanting to have more war against tribal communities, right? Why else would you move the agency that deals with tribal communities into the War Department unless you're envisioning more military engagements? What would be an alternate argument for that? Why else might somebody make that argument, Taylor?
Wanted to make sure that, I guess the government recognized them as having their own sovereignty. Okay. Because they're foreign nations that they're dealing with, rather than part of the landscape, I guess. Okay. Yeah. So Parker. One argument could be that this would be an acknowledgement of sovereignty. Okay. So not having this in the Interior Department would be an acknowledgement of that. Okay. What do you think, Daniel?
Well, since many of the worst conflicts were between native armed groups and the U.S. military. Having Indian agents embedded with field commanders could have helped to, especially competent commissioners, could have helped to alleviate some of the tensions. Also, since the military would have been on the frontiers mostly, it would have been more advantageous for them. They would have also gotten access to the military logistics, so they could provide rations and things like that.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So somehow working out the relationship between civilian Indian agents and military commanders might somehow help with these tensions. That would be a legitimate argument. Bob?
I imagine the Interior Department just as now would handle mining claims and therefore, represent what the settlers want in terms of resources.
Yeah. So that was actually front and center in Parker's argument, was that by putting the Office of Indian Affairs back into the War Department, it would protect it from the influence of land speculators and mineral extraction agencies and people who might have sort of connections in their sort of hands into the Interior Department. Absolutely. Ian, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, it's kind of similar to that. All I was going to say is that by including it in the War Department, you could not only, it would give you the ability to react easier to hostile conflict, but also allow you to protect the claims and the land titles itself from the militia who decides that they want to go kill people.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
If we've always signed treaties expecting that these Indian nations are separate nations, why doesn't the Bureau of Indian Affairs show up in the State Department?
Yeah, and that's a really valid and good question. Why doesn't it? I don't have an answer for that, but it's a really good and valid question.
I think the answer is we're lying through our teeth when we say that.
Sure. Parker would make that argument too. In fact, there's this famous quote where, I'm going to jump forward just a second and then come back. In 1871, as we mentioned previously, the United States government unilaterally decides it would no longer negotiate treaties with tribal nations, right? It ends the treaty-making process unilaterally. Parker supports that. And that may seem strange, right? First Native American Commissioner of Indian Affairs, a person who has spent his entire life advocating and helping to maintain the sovereignty of his home community and then tribal communities across the country, and yet he supports the end of treaty making. He says that negotiating treaties with the United States government for tribal communities looks like a jug with a handle, right? All of the power and control is on one side, right? Imagine like a pitcher, right? And that the United States has the military power to enforce its side of the treaties, and that for the most part tribal communities didn't. He said it was an uneven playing field, and that it was a farce, in fact, to say that tribal communities could negotiate on even footing with the United States, and rather it needed to rely on the humanitarian sort of feelings of the United States. So that's an interesting point. There's one other point that really factored into Parker's argument for why he wanted to move the Office of Indian Affairs, and that was he was interested in bureaucratization and efficiency. So think about this. At the end of the Civil War, the most bureaucratized, I don't know if I would argue efficient, but at least the most well-developed bureaucracy in the federal government was the War Department. It had just carried out a massive war effort, well beyond the scope of any kind of war effort the United States had carried on before. It had become modernized in so many ways. And Parker, having considerable amounts of experience over the previous 4 to 5 years with the U.S. Army, saw the War Department as the most bureaucratized and perhaps the most protected against corruption. He also believed that in the honorability, he also believed in the honor of military men. And he believed that they would serve the Office of Indian Affairs more honorably than the civilian agents who had proven themselves to be quite corrupt in the years leading up to this. So does that make sense? This is a point that I argue kind of counter to what most other historians have argued. And that most other historians have argued that this indicates sort of putting the Office of Indian Affairs on a more wartime footing. And I just think that misses a whole lot of evidence and misses a whole argument that it's important for us to pay attention to. Parker believed that the government should provide money, goods, services, and new opportunities for Native people in the form of education, because it needed to compensate for a history of dispossession and ongoing colonization. But he also believed that given these opportunities, money, capital for buying farm equipment and developing infrastructure, programs for education and vocational training and things like that, he believed that Native people would choose to assimilate. The Native people would see the benefits in these things if given the opportunity and time. Parker's timeline is different in this time period. What he envisions is different than the people who want to expand to the West. People who want to expand to the West, assimilation needs to happen now, or Native people need to be pushed out of the way. Parker says if we give people time, then they will do this on their own. Does that make sense? Under Parker's guidance, the Office of Indian Affairs would develop a series of programs that becomes known as the Peace Policy. So starting really at the end of 1868, but moving into 1869, there's a series of programs that make up what we think of as the peace policy. So here's some of the things it did. Define the role of the reservations. As long as Native people remained on the reservations, they would be protected by the Office of Indian Affairs. If they left, then the military would have jurisdiction over them. I think it's important to note that although Parker advocated for the movement of the Office of Indian Affairs to the War Department, it never actually happens. Right? It becomes known as the transfer debate, and it goes on for several years. It never actually happens. So the Office of Indian Affairs stays in the Interior Department from 1849 to the present day. The day-to-day administration of Indian Affairs would be placed in the hands of religious organizations. This was Parker's other idea, and it was the idea of Quaker lobbyists as well. If civilian Indian agents hadn't proved themselves to be particularly trustworthy, and you couldn't install military Indian agents, then religious leaders could perhaps be trusted more so than other civilian agents. So by 1872, 73 Indian agents had been assigned to different religious groups, predominantly Protestant, although there were a few Catholic Indian agencies, but predominantly Protestant and predominantly Quaker. Another name for this set of policies is the Quaker policy. I prefer the peace policy because I think it encompasses much more than just this one idea. In 1869, Congress established the Board of Indian Commissioners. Now, this is where it might be confusing, Eleanor, because you asked, were there more commissioners? So Parker's the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, but then there's a Board of Indian Commissioners that's put together to serve as that oversight board that Parker had kind of wanted previously. You started to raise your hand. Was there something that you wanted to?
I wanted to know if the missionary agents were more honest than the others, or if they stole from the Indians as well.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that there are a lot of different things that happened. Some of them on the Quaker agencies very good and positive, and others less so. So I think it ran the gamut. So Congress establishes the Board of Indian Commissioners. Now remember, Parker wanted an oversight committee that was made up of Native people and non-Native people. Right? He thought that this would be sort of like, like a watchdog organization to make sure that the Board of Indian, the Office of Indian Affairs was getting good annuities, like when it was sending rations, treaty rations and things, that they weren't sending rotten food and poor quality goods and things like that. This was supposed to make sure that the federal government was upholding its responsibilities based on its treaty agreements and trust relationships. So Parker wants Native people and non-Native people on this organization. In 1 second, I'll show you who actually ends up on this organization. The peace policy also allocated money for the establishment of schools and the appointment of teachers on reservations. Quite a bit of money, actually, something like $2 million in 1860s money. And that was something that Parker was really, really proud of. Grant and Parker stressed the importance of fulfilling existing treaties with tribal communities. Again, think about Parker's previous experiences, right? Sort of dealing with treaties and things like that. But this is interesting. So even if the treaties were negotiated under less than legal circumstances, Parker still believed the treaties themselves were legal and that they needed to be upheld. But he also advocated ending the treaty-making process in 1871. From that point on, any agreements between the United States and Native nations would take the form of executive orders. Again, I sort of already explained what Parker's thinking was on that, so I'm not going to go back into it there, but this is a controversial thing about Parker. Some scholars say look at that as kind of selling out tribal communities. I think we have to look at it from the perspective of what it looked like in 1870 and 1871, rather than sort of looking back from a presentist viewpoint and say, oh, he was selling out tribal communities and selling out the idea of sovereignty. I think Parker was looking at it, as I said before, as like a political entrepreneur and as somebody who practiced sort of like pragmatic politics. He was a pragmatist.
If their executive orders and they're no longer separate nations, do the Native Americans become citizens?
No, and as we move forward and talk about the allotment program that comes out next after the peace policy, we'll talk about how the sort of the ironies and confusions of this status really play a key role in the legacies of it. Yeah, go ahead, Ian.
I'm a little confused because I was understanding the ideas of fulfilling the treaties and then also ending the treaty-making process. I got that, but the executive order bit, I mean, I get it that he trusts Grant, but I don't understand the motivations there. I mean, he's got to understand that, like, the power of executive orders.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that he is optimistic in the sense that those executive orders would be done with humanitarian efforts in mind. Remember where his political education came from. This is key, and you guys read about this. What was the case in Western New York when the Seneca were being removed? Who became their allies? Neighbors, right? Local white settlers who had a shared enemy in the eastern land speculators and land companies, right? That's going to be so much different than the situation in the Trans-Mississippi West. In some ways, Parker's political education set him up to misunderstand how things were going to play out a generation later, right? Everything that he had learned up to this point in his personal experience had been that there could be shared interest and allyship here. This is not going to be the case in the Dakotas. This is not going to be the case in the Southern Plains. This is not going to be the case in California. Does it make sense? So the real tragedy in Parker's life isn't that he was a sellout in any way. The real tragedy in Parker's life is that his political education set him up to fail.
But the Eastern Indians were basically farmers and understood that, whereas the Plains and Western Indians were not.
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. So the peace policy becomes a not so peaceful policy almost immediately. When Parker began his tenure as Commissioner of Indian Affairs, he ran into conflict and controversy right away. William Welsh, who was an Episcopal missionary and the leader of the newly created Board of Indian Commissioners, gained considerable power in 1870, 1871, and used it to advance an alternate kind of policy reform campaign that differed drastically from some of Parker's ideas. So I mentioned that this was the Board of Indian Commissioners as it was created. And remember, Parker was imagining native and non-native people working together on this. Here's what they ended up with. An Episcopal layman, Felix Bruno, who was a businessman. Now look at what all these guys are involved in here. Dry goods, blankets, dry goods, fur trapper, dry goods. These are all people who represent industries that benefit from Indian confinement, the reservations. Some of them were involved in railroads. These are all people who are wealthy philanthropists, right? Many of them. Very few of them had any direct experience working with tribal communities. All of them stand to benefit personally in one way or another from a continuing process of reservations and confinement. Does that make sense? These men, involved in dry goods, mineral extraction, transportation, they held a driving philosophy. Their underlying philosophy was that Christian philanthropists in the United States understood the best interests of Indian people, better than Indian people themselves. And they worked within the early peace policy time period to monitor the appropriations and rations, purchase and the dispersal of goods and supplies, but they also pursued their own reform agenda that causes incredible tension with Parker. And it was characterized by its kind of Christian, coercive, civilizing character. The key feature of William Welsh and the Board of Indian Commissioners' ideas was that they wanted to continue to dispossess Indians of their lands. They wanted to hold them on increasingly smaller reservations, and they wanted to undermine sovereignty. So in this crucial moment following the Civil War, 1868, 1869, 1870, when the federal government is beginning to experiment with social policy, alternate types of social policy, things we might call like compensatory policy, like to compensate, right? This is the Freedmen's Bureau and the kinds of policies that are being developed to help former slaves incorporate themselves into the larger body politic. So at the same time that this is going on, that there's actually pretty radical changes going on in the federal government at a time when a radical change in the history of Indian-white relations could take place, these men, right, these men right here, advance a body of suggestions that is differing in no significant way from the kinds of suggestions that have been advocated for generations, right? Remove Indians, confine Indians, force them to assimilate as quickly as possible, or die out, right? Make sense? Sound familiar?
Question.
Yeah.
In the reading for this week, there was a lot about whether the condition of Indians was due to lack of civilization or to their race. Mm-hmm. Like, could they become civilized if they were Indians because their race was inferior?
Right. Yeah.
Okay, that's 40 years before this.
Yeah.
With somebody like Parker being at the head of this organization, are people now feeling that Indians could be raised to be the equal of whites, or they still think they're an inferior race?
Sure, the same kinds of people who had fought for abolition and anti-slavery, who believed that in full civil rights and potential of African American people, believe the same thing for Native American people. That's not everybody, but there are those people that believe that. So on the one side of this tension is somebody like Parker, right, who's advocating policies that would give resources to tribal people, a kind of compensatory policy that might be similar to some Reconstruction policies, to give them time and opportunities to assimilate. On the other hand, you've got people like these guys who are looking for more of the same.
What about Grant? Does he say, I think the Indians could be equal, or does he say, some of my best friends are Indians?
No, I think that Grant supports the peace policy and the kinds of ideas that Parker advocates. But I don't want to stifle conversation, but I want to move to some bit of a conclusion here in the last couple of minutes before we run out of time. Ian?
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
Who determined that these guys got on the board?
They were appointed. They were appointed through the. Grant signs off on it, but they're appointed through the executive branch. Yeah. So I started out with this point that this was a moment of optimism, but it's fleeting. So why is it fleeting? How and why was this a period of opportunity lost for Native people, and how does that connect to a larger Reconstruction era? Despite all the efforts of reformers to reshape Indian policy, the reality was that it would be impossible to hold these two simultaneous goals: give Native people opportunities, resources, and time to assimilate, and develop the West as quickly as possible. Those two things can't exist simultaneously, right? The two images from the beginning of the lecture, one showing Indian inclusion, one showing westward progress, simply could not coexist. As non-native settlers moved west, they continued to encroach on native lands and worked to dispossess them. These interactions became increasingly violent throughout the 1870s. We can return to our example of the Lakota and the Black Hills, right? In 1874, General George Armstrong Custer led a military expedition into the region and verified the reports of gold. Gold seekers and settlers flooded into the region, violating the Treaty of 1868, the Fort Laramie Treaty, and fought pitched battles with the Lakota. The Army sent an ultimatum ordering all Lakota and Northern Cheyenne to return to their reservations in early 1876, and when they didn't comply, General George Crook and General Custer attacked. Crook was turned back by Crazy Horse. Custer and the 7th Cavalry, as we know, suffered one of the worst defeats in the history of the United States at the hands of Sitting Bull and the warriors and his warriors at the Battle of Little Bighorn or the Greasy Grass. Similar episodes of violence exploded throughout the plains in North and Southwest in the 1870s, and it was often the Indians who suffered the worst of these engagements. From the perspective of the reformers and policymakers who had advocated the peace policy only a few years prior, it looks like there's no peace. Native people are resisting aspects of the civilization policies. From the Indian perspective, this sort of makes sense. They wanted to maintain their homelands and felt that the United States owed them any opportunities that they chose to accept, that they could choose to accept or not accept whatever they wished, right? As a result, reformers and policymakers in the late 1870s and throughout the 1880s come to the conclusion that they would have to change Indian policy once again. They believed that the reservations had failed because Indians were too community-minded. They had no incentive to become individual farmers and producers. They would then work, these reformers, to break apart reservations and divide the land into individual family-held plots. Right? This is going to be the allotment policy of the 1880s through the 1930s. This would result in a final land grab in which tribal communities lose about 100 million of the 150 million acres of land that they held by the end of the 19th century. Although this period, as I said, opened with optimism for Native people, with optimism for Native inclusion and a firm place in the American nation, by the end of the 1870s, much like the experience of African Americans in the South, the needs and goals of mainstream society came to overshadow and end this optimistic period. I want to end with one final thought about this, and that is the 14th Amendment. What is the 14th Amendment of the Constitution? Someone please know the 14th Amendment?
Citizenship.
Okay, right. Citizenship for African American people, former slaves, right? I want us to think about what citizenship might mean for Native American people, because we're going to take up this idea after our break. It's understandable how the 14th Amendment and how citizenship and political inclusion is important for African American communities, particularly in the aftermath of slavery and facing segregation and other things, right? Think about what citizenship in the colonizing nation means for colonized people. Is that a good thing or not? Is that something, is that a reward? Is that a benefit? Is that something to strive for? Or is it something else? You guys have done a great job today. I really appreciate all the interaction and everything. So thanks, and thanks for all being here. Appreciate it.
Join us every Saturday